The United States makes the UN work when it wants it to work. And that is exactly the way it should be, because the only question for the United States is what's in our national interest.
My name is John, and the International Criminal Court is back in session. It is February 23rd, 2026, and we're going to look at the situation in Ukraine. So, let's start. First of all, we're going to look at the Zaporizhzhia/Dnipropetrovsk direction. The armed forces of Ukraine, according to AMK mapping, that is, supposedly recaptured Andriivka, Bratsky, and Ostapavsky. But as of right now, there are no sorts of evidence to confirm these advances. But he suggests that the Ukrainians have forced the Russians to withdraw from this part of Dnipropetrovsk region, and that they're going to retake all these areas back from the Russians. There is still no signs whatsoever on what is happening with the Russians in Vishnive, Verbove, and Stepove, though it is likely that the Ukrainians do control Koroshi and Sosnovka. In my opinion, I think Syriac is going a little bit too, over-exaggerated with the villages of Gai, Novoalexandrovka, and Oleksovka. But otherwise, though, I feel like he should give these areas, paint them in a gray zone. I think that would be more appropriate to do that than to, honestly, just hand them over to the AFU on a silver platter. I don't think it is wise to do that. We have no proof of any flag raisings, and we also don't have any indication whatsoever of the Ukrainians consolidating their control over the villages. But time will tell. Maybe I am very wrong, and that AMK is very right. But we'll just have to wait and see what happens. In the direction of Gule-Pule, or more like Orikov direction now, the Russians have continued to push westwards, and they're about to contest for the village of Verkhna Tursa. Should they take control of this village, they'll have control over the southern road to the bigger village of Vozdvi Zivka. Sorry if I butchered the pronunciation on there, but it is what it is. And they're also about to contest for the village of Herk 2. Now, going to the former Krasnaya Amisk / Pokrovsk direction, the Russians reportedly have taken control over half, if not majority, over the village or town of Grishino. Syriac has not painted it yet, but it's kind of likely by now that the Russians do control at least 50% of Grishino. And then going up here, basically the Russians are continuing to advance on Biletsky, and there's also reports that the Russians have advanced north of the Pokrovsk coal mine and are advancing towards the strategic border, Dnipropetrovsk border village of Sergivka. Now, while it is actually in Donetsk region, it does border Dnipropetrovsk. So, if the Russians are able to reach Sergivka and take it, then they should be able to finally do a proper push on the Dnipropetrovsk region from the former Pokrovsk direction. Now, going to the Konstantinovka direction, or actually, you know what, let's not do that. Let's go to the Dobropila direction. So apparently, some mappers are starting to reward Novy Donbass to the Russians, so that would put them at the doorstep of Dobropila city. And there's also reports of some Russian advances west of Shakovo in these areas here. I think they're like salt mines or something. And the Russians are about to re-enter the strategic village of Kutrivyar, which would put them at the gates of another strategic village, which is Zoloty Kolodiaz, which the Ukrainians managed to retake in a counteroffensive during summer of 2025. And the Russians are also continuing their pushes too, from the villages of Turetsky and Novopavlovka, but otherwise not much has changed. But getting back to Konstantinovka direction, there have been a good amount of changes here. Bialystok, I think, is now under complete Russian control. It's just a matter of when Syriac will paint the rest of this orange. And then you have the Russians, of course, entering the commie block areas of Konstantinovka. This is the main heart, like the main fortress of Konstantinovka. And there's also some reports that a dam was blown up by the Russians, too, in this area. And if this were to be confirmed, then southern Konstantinovka is kind of cooked. So that would mean over 50 to 60% of the city would be completely vulnerable to a Russian takeover. Though I think the northern part of the city of Konstantinovka is going to be a lot tougher for the Russians to capture. I mean, for obvious reasons. But honestly, though, if they at least take this, then it's pretty much over. I don't think the Ukrainians are going to really put that much of an effort for it, at least after 2 to 3 more months pass on by, because once this citadel here falls, then I think it's kind of done, because I don't think most of these are really going to hold for long, because you have to understand that most of Konstantinovka is low-rise housing, private, single-family homes, and the only commie blocks in the northern area are here and here, but otherwise, that's pretty much it. Now, going further up north, in the direction of Slovyansk and the Kramatorsk, yes, we got to talk about Slovyansk and the Kramatorsk direction, that is, because why not? The Russians have taken complete control over the village of Minkovka, and have also continued fighting for the village of Glubovka as well. And they have also continued to push in the direction of Rai Alexandrovka, and have also reportedly captured the entirety of Lipovka. Nikiforovka is, according to some sources, under complete Russian control, but Syriac, though, has this chunk of the northern part of the village still in a gray zone, but I think it's under Russian control by now. Now, should the Russians take control over Yurkovka, Dibrova, and Fedorovka Dora, then the Russians will have essentially the terrain advantage over both Slovyansk and the Kramatorsk. So, they'll be able to fire upon both cities without that much of an issue with either conventional artillery shellings or FPV drones, which in turn will lead to both cities being evacuated en masse and turned into ghost towns. I think in the next 4 to 5 months from now, or 6 months at the latest, the Russians will be at the outskirts of Slovyansk and the Kramatorsk. There you go. That's my take. And then going into the former Siversk direction, which at this point is now the Liman direction, the Russians have also pushed further southwards onto the fields outside of Siversk, and they are about to contest for the villages of Kalenki, and are also right now fighting for Kryva Luka. Once the Russians capture Kryva Luka, then they'll be able to cross the river here and meet up with Zapad grouping here that is fighting in Liman, and then they'll eventually be able to push towards the strategic town of Mykolaievka, which is the main gateway to the city of Slovyansk. In fact, there is a power station here that I think is responsible for a big chunk, if not the entirety, of Slovyansk's power and water. So if the Russians are able to take this, then we can kind of consider Slovyansk to be pretty cooked. So yeah, the Russians are going to advance alongside the Servetsky Donets River on both the northern and the southern sides. Going into Liman itself, the Russians are continuing to fight for the outskirts of the city. They have not only recaptured all of Stavki, but they're now advancing north of the outskirts of Liman too, so that would mean all these tree lines and fields. And in addition, the Ukrainians have also attempted to fight back and recaptured some chunks of Dobryshovo. Urova is still contested, and also, according to a recent report by the Russian Ministry of Defense, they claimed full capture of Karpovka, right here. Now, I don't know how true this is, and it could be false, but if this were to be true, then they have a lot of open fields to the Oska River and also to the strategic town of Borova. I don't honestly think the Ukrainians will be able to stop them once Karpovka falls. I mean, yeah, this is pretty important for a various amount of reasons. And then going into the direction of Kupiansk, the Russians have continued pushing within the suburb of Petropavlovka and have also continued to surround the village of Kucherovka as well. And there is also now a report circulating that the Russians have advanced and have taken ground within the strategic town of Kupiansk-Vuzlove, not to be confused with Kupiansk proper, which is right here. But yeah, the Russians appear to have taken control, or at least are contesting right now for a big chunk of Kupiansk-Vuzlove. And if true, I guess we can consider the entirety of this portion of the Kupiansk direction to be firmly in Russian hands. Like, it will fall to the Russians within months. Though I honestly don't know how much longer it's going to take them. And I also don't know if this is true, because you have to understand that right now we're at the peak of winter and Rasputitsa has yet to hit. But once the weather begins to thaw, then yeah, we're going to get a clear answer. But we can expect Russian advances here to go a little faster if these reports from Kupiansk-Vuzlove and Petropavlovka are true. But otherwise, I think it will continue to be slow, at least in the Borova direction, and most directions, of course, in Ukraine. And there's also some reports that the Russians, in the direction of Veliki Burluk, have begun to fire upon a village of Kolodiazny. So, supposedly they're getting ready for a push here. If true, then that means they're going to try to take control more of the Kharkiv region and try to reach Veliki Burluk here, which is a strategic town that connects the Russian border with Ukraine. Also the area of Volchansk and also the area of Kupiansk. They want to take both. Not much going on here in the Volchansk direction, other than the fact that the Russians do control Volchansk itself. Same with the main Kharkiv or Lipsy direction. And then going to Sumy, there are reports of limited Russian advances north of the village of Mala Korchakovka. So right here. So they're like right just at the tip of the spear. Like they're about to enter this big forested area here, which I'm expecting to be very difficult for the Russians to fight for. But otherwise, though, the Russians have retaken most of the areas that they lost during the Ukrainians' attempted counteroffensive to clear the Russians out from this area. And then finally, in this part of the Sumy region, not much has really changed other than the fact that Ukrainians can't boot them out. And that's it for today's video. I hope you all enjoyed it, found it informative, and leave a comment below and tell me what you think of the recent situation in Ukraine. So, I'll see you guys all next time, and I'll catch you all later. Peace out. Bye.